So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Rob Butler from the University of Aberdeen. I'm told your formal title is Professor of Tectonics, I think you said.
Yep.
And for his sins, he's head of school at the moment.
Head of department.
Oh, head of department.
That means that's
we have schools.
Financial responsibility, which is great.
We have schools, we have departments. Head of department at the moment. However, he's actually going to tell us about his research, which I'm sure is much more interesting than all the admin you have to do. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. This is part of a series of talks I've been giving over the last 10 days or so, associated with it's the centenary of the demise of Archibald Geikie, who by a long way is the most decorated earth scientist that Britain has had, rising to the position of President of the Royal Society. Those are his dates up there. So he obviously passed away 100 years ago. I want to look at some of his career, and this is by no means a celebration of him. I'd like that, and that's not to say that he didn't do interesting work, but the reason that he's a great, I'm interested in the history of geology for the lessons it gives us today, and about how we behave as scientists in terms of promoting effective collaborations and learning from each other. And I'll get to the point, he wasn't very good at that. And that is useful because what he was a really prolific writer and recorder. So we can actually learn and see what he was doing and maybe try and understand some of his motivations, where they're coming from. I do not want to try and interpret what he did and say what he got wrong. What's important, as I say, is to learn from that for ourselves about how we do a better job here in the 21st century. So here are a couple of maps that have got his name on, one from 1876, one from 1910, at the end of his career. And what we're going to be looking at is as part of what he was up to and the debates he was involved with around something called the Highlands controversy. Now, this is something that's very well known, I'm sure, to many people in the room, because Edinburgh was very much part of that debate. And many of the people that you'll see popping up over the next little while have got track records here, not necessarily in this building, but in the University of Edinburgh and in the Edinburgh scene. So we're going to look at the Highlands controversy, which is about that part of the world up there. Straight away, disclosure. This book by this guy, if you only ever read one history of science book that's geological relevant, that's the one to read. It's fantastic as a dynamic account of the debates that we're going to touch on over the next few minutes. And I have history with this because I got a copy of this preprint when I was working in the Himalayas and did a review for New Scientist. And I was struck by the stories, not only because I was interested in Northwest Highlands, but because what they told us about the way in which knowledge was created and the missed opportunities in those stories from the protagonists. And particularly at the time when I was working, which was around Nanga Parbat, we were some of the first geologists in there. There had been others in the same way as when Geikie was working up in the Northwest Highlands, there had been other geologists, but very few. And I was concerned, was I going down the same path that the early protagonists were doing in the Northwest Highlands, reaching wrong conclusions by doing things too quickly, making too much out of a few bits that we happen to have bumped into and not getting a general picture? I still worry about that, not necessarily there so much, but in general. So I thought I'd show some, Geikie, not only did he write a lot, he also has a staggering collection of pictures. Worth plugging Hazelmere Museum, which is where the Geikie archives kept. You might think that's a bit strange, but that's where he retired, and he gave a lot of money to the museum, and as part of that deal, they got his archive. And there are over 750 paintings from him, mostly little field sketches like these watercolors, many of which are online, and you go to the museum, there's a fantastic online archive you can browse through. They're still trying to work out where a lot of the site, well, that one you can work out if you can read his horrible scroll, and you probably recognize the view anyway. But many you can't identify. they don't know where they are. So if people want to go on there and then contact their archivist and say, I recognize that view, this is where it is, they'd be really grateful. So we're going to get further back, and we're going to start off, the debate of the Highlands controversy starts off as a debate between these guys. Roderick Impey Murchison, Director General, grand title of the Geological Survey, the second such person to hold that position, and James Nicol, who is my academic ancestor, professor of what would have been geology in the day, but wasn't, was natural history in Aberdeen. These are two maps, each by themselves, of the area of northern Scotland. And the debate concerns the big area that runs down the middle of the northern part of Scotland, which is this stuff. Murchison considered it to be Silurian in age, part of the stratigraphic succession. We're going to look at that in a minute. They are recognizably sedimentary in places. Otherwise, they have this sort of schistose character, but they're also metamorphic. So let's start with Nicol. Nicol said that the contacts between the metamorphic rocks in green and the sedimentary rocks that I haven't colored in contain a fault, and this strange stuff, which features in the title, which subsequent people termed the Logan Rock. He didn't use that term, but it's a convenient term for us to use. He used it called all sorts of things. But it's this strange crystalline material that lies adjacent to the contact that he said was faulted with the method separating sedimentary rocks, which we call the moine now, from the unmetamorphosed rocks over here. And that's it in the field. So he said it was faulted. Let's go to what the Director General, the supreme authority, as he would have it, said about this material up here. So that's his cross-section. There's Murchison, and let's take it apart. So I've added some color. Start off with the fundamental gneiss. That's what we would now call the Lewisian. It's metamorphic rocks. By definition, for their mind, Precambrian. Therefore, the first sedimentary rocks that lie on top are by definition Cambrian. We now know it's Torridonian. And then everything after that would be the next package up, Silurian in their money, which is all that lot. And he basically said the whole lot, even though it's metamorphosed, passes all the way up to the Devonian rocks on the side of the Moray Firth over on the right-hand side. So a simple succession. The intrusions are important. I was quite surprised when I started thinking about it, why he bothered showing the intrusions on that profile. They sort of get in the way. But the point is, back then, there was no real collective theory of metamorphism like we have today. And the idea was that you had to have intrusions to essentially cook the sediments to make, that's the only theory. The idea of burial of uplifted old rocks, of deep rocks from mountain building processes, forget it, that's a much later realization. So they were always on the hunt for intrusions to do the cooking for them. Meanwhile, Nicol does this. He says a fault. He is happy and wants to represent much more complex geology than Murchison does. There's a lot of relationships down in here that are more complicated than a simple up to the east progression. So he likes complexity, doesn't he? You might not like it, but he's having to deal with it and he recognizes it, whereas Murchison doesn't want that. Right, so let's look at what he's doing. This is Nicol's map, and this is the fault contact, the structure we now call the Moyne thrust, separating the Moyne series from the sedimentary. And one of his really important sections is here. On the north side of Loch Marie, there it is. Let's add the color again. He has all those components that Murchison has over on the west side. He has some more Silurian. He has a fault contact with what we call the Moyne. And on it, he says there's this strange rock. He calls it diorite. Don't think that's a strict petrographic diorite. It's a term he uses. He uses all sorts of words that would now be strictly defined in terms of igneous compositions and textures, but they almost used interchangeably to mean crystalline rock. And he does more of it. There's a couple of other sections you don't see quite so often, through the Erebol area, up on the north coast, through Glencool in North Assynt. And this is granulite, again, something just meaning strange crystalline rock, potentially igneous in his mind. And this diorite, again, sitting in there, mixing around, disturbing the otherwise simple stratigraphic sequence that Murchison thinks. And then we come to this site, which we're going to visit a few times, because this was really important, partly because it became quite accessible as it is today. So this is Nicol's section across it. Colored all the way across, and there is a granite vein along the contact. So why does he put it there? We'll see in a minute that's problematic. Well, if you look at the adjacent cliffs, the whole series of intrusions in there. So it's not completely wacky yet. There's clearly if you're going to understand the full geology of this area, there are intrusions that you can walk up to, mapped today as L site. So there we go. So he's got these components. The question really is, are they as he suggests? That's his section. So he thinks there's a faulted contact. And for him, now let's think about this. He says it's a faulted contact, and he says if it's a fault, it has to be steep. And what's more, if it's a fault, it's likely to have igneous rocks on it. And you might think, why? Okay, understanding of faults in terms of British geology at the time was largely based on coal mines. And if you're mining along a gallery and your coal seam runs out, bang, the fault's going to come in and offset it, and it's steep across the gallery. So the concept of low-angle faults did not exist in Britain. Faults, by definition, are steep because they downthrow or upthrow the coal seam you're working on. Secondly, faults are part of a turmoil of the internal earth, as are volcanoes. So if you've got faults, let's have some more turmoil, have some igneous rocks on them. So it becomes a theory that says, if we really think there's a fault there, it really should have igneous rocks on it to add the game. So we have these two competing ideas. Murchison thinks it's simple. Nicol thinks it's complicated. He's making some definitive statements about what that contact looks like. It's steep, it's a fault, and it's got igneous rocks along it. Right, move the story in, and let's introduce Geikie again, because most of that debate plays out. It's published either side of 1860, but Nicol presents it at the British Association in 1859. Murchison tries to shout him down. There's a public debate, needs resolving. So Murchison decides to go and do some field work. The catch is he's 68. So he gets Archibald Geikie. So let's look at Geikie's CV at the time. Precocious isn't the word for it. So he starts work on Skye, essentially before he even starts university. He goes and starts pottering around Skye, essentially collecting Jurassic fossils. On the strength, and he comes back and networks with the intelligentsia in this city. So he meets Hugh Miller, exchanges letters with Hugh Miller. He meets Charles Lyell and talks about it. So he's networked with the movers and shakers of earth science here. And on the strength of that, more or less, gets a job working for the Geological Survey. He becomes the second member, alongside Henry Howell, in the Geological Survey of Scotland, effectively. There's two of them. He's age 19, Howell's age 20, and they're tasked with mapping the Central Belt. I spoke about that at Hazelmere, so and that's recorded. So if you want to go back and hear that story, that's something else. Okay, so he's doing that. He presents the Skye work at the Geological Society of London. But he didn't present it; he had to go out and map. So it was presented by the president. A year later, he writes the story of a boulder. If you haven't seen that book, it sounds that's kind of a bit esoteric. Boulder, how much story are you going to get out of that? It is not that. It's the story of Carboniferous Central Belt. Goes all over the place talking about that. And he wants it to be the equivalent of Old Red Sandstone that Hugh Miller writes, and is a bestseller at the time. He's doing this at a really young age. He also then, following that, is the principal author on the geological map of Edinburgh, which is published by the survey. So clearly, Murchison thinks this is the guy to get. If I want to get somebody, not only is he running around making maps, but he's also promoting the story, writing public science. So who better to get to go up to the Northwest Highlands and join me to tell my story to the world, which is what he does. So start of August, they leave the Clyde. Haven't quite worked out how they did it, but they apparently went all the way around here. They may have gone through the canal through there, can't tell, but or they went around the bottom. But either way, they went through there, and largely it was Murchison touring his mates in the grand houses, shooting estates along the west side. And eventually, at the end of the month, they hit Torridon, ready to go and look at these contacts. Right, famous bit now. In one day, Murchison goes off and potters around and goes around to the coast. Meanwhile, this is what Geikie does in a day. walks across one entire map sheet, more or less along the contacts between what is the Moyne in the yellow and the unmetamorphosed and the Lewisian rocks over on the left, across there. I think if you want to have an example of confirmation bias, this is the best story I know in geology. So this is, he walks under those cliffs. Let's just give it, they're the quartzites. He walks underneath. If you look back, look onto it, there, gneiss on top. We know that now. He never went onto that hill. We'll see where he did go another time later, but he went up that valley in the Torridonian, what he thought was Cambrian at the time. Looking back, this is what you see. So this is the strike section, and everything looks simple, with, you know, apparently simple succession of rocks that are broadly conformable, even though they're gneiss on top. He never went up there to look. In a book that he published, the 3rd edition of the Senior of Scotland in 1901, when after this debate was all finished, he was still anxious to point out that he didn't make stupid mistakes. He was just misled by the vagaries of geology, which wasn't playing straight with him. And so that's the cross section he shows that way, but he still shows the strike section that gives the impression that, well, of course, everybody misled by that. You know, he's covering his back. He does it all the time in his writing. It's really quite strange. Anyway, on we go. So here's his field sketch. Here's his sketch. That's the view of it, the Loch and Nid in the back of Beyond. That's his sketch he made in the 1880s when he went back there with a bit of geology drawn in. And that's there halfway along his walk as he's heading towards Ullapool. And eventually he reaches Ullapool. And you might think, wow, how's he managed to do all that geology in that day? And the answer is, he didn't. He wrote his notebook up the following day. And you can see, if you read his scroll, you can see, returning to the inn, because he'd gone out the following day in Ullapool and got rained off, he's gone back for lunch, and then he's decided to write up the notes of what he saw the following day. Nevertheless, he's really adamant. No clearer case could possibly exist. By, you know, it's the structure he's walked past at quite high speed is definitive. And I think the failure to recognize uncertainty is lesson number 1. Those sketches become the core of a paper he writes up with Murchison. And Murchison likes this so much, he then, in a comment to his own paper, writes that, observing closely, he didn't even visit the rocks, he didn't even write them up at the time. Right? Any of you who are undergraduates in the audience or listening in on the screen, this is bad. You should write your notes in the field when confronted with the actual things that you can test. But basically, this becomes definitive. So there he is. In early September, he's in Ullapool, and he eventually makes it up to Knocken. Place where Nicol has said that's what's going on. And what's more, Geikie goes and checks it out. So there's his field sketch across this. I don't know if he did this the following day or did it in the field. He might have done it, given the state of some of that writing, he might have done it in the horse and cart on his way back to the pub. But anyway, he gets that. Let's look at his published profile through this, and let's add the color. So there we go. We've got the sedimentary rocks over here. There's all sorts of problems with it, but nevertheless, it shows the idea of a succession simply getting younger from left to right as you go up, with the succession up there with the what we call Moyne sitting on top of the Durness carbonates. So there we are. The question is that vertical? No. Has it got igneous rocks on it? No. So Nicol now falls flat on his face. He's been disproved, and not only by this section, which is robust in terms of it looks like Geikie's done his job properly, but it's then caught by all this slightly fake stuff that he's done a few days before walking across that land. So it's conformal. There are no igneous rocks on it. Conformal, I just mean the contacts parallel to the layering underneath. Right, and that is not what it's like. So, problem for these guys at the top. Just because it's conformal doesn't make it a stratigraphic contact. The only reason for thinking it's stratigraphic is to say that it is parallel to the underlying bedding. So it has the same geometry as all the other bits that you can see on the diagram over there. They fail to explain why there's metamorphic rocks with a direct junction onto sedimentary. They're not worried about that. They're just happy about the geometry. Nickel is correct. Metamorphic juxtaposition requires there to be a fault there, or the whole lot to be upside down. But he also says that faults have to have magma on them. So what we have here are two examples of theory overriding the observations. Both cases, nickel probably worse, because he's faking the geometry, something you can actually see, and he's actually inventing observations, the igneous rocks on the contact. So many people think that nickel is the hero of the story because subsequently, obviously, people have said it's a fault, it's the Moyne thrust. But actually, he's done probably the worst sin, which is to say that he's faked his observations. Bad idea. People let theory and fancy ideas run away from basic observations repeatedly. You see it many places. It's the expectation you see of the beautiful interpretation. You don't want to get it messed around by actual facts. He says cynically. So what does Murchison say to this? And he recognizes that there may be things going on, but he says that nickel's been misled by assigning much too great an importance to what he considers to be local and partial disturbances only. What's he mean by that? Because the day that these guys, Murchison and Geikie, arrived in Kinlochewe, just up from Torridon, Geikie went out for a walk the following day. It was a Sunday. And he walked into this ground, which for me is some of the most spectacular structural geology anywhere, not just in Scotland. You've got repetitions of white rocks, what we know as the Cambrian quartzites, the brown, which is the Torridonian. And he recognized this. And they even published it in Murchison and Geikie. That is a hill called Benliath Moor, Munro, one of the best geological Munros, I think, anywhere. And that's a slightly weird, but nevertheless quite interesting cross-section underneath there, which shows Geikie's interpretation of it, which shows repetitions by reverse faults that repeat the stratigraphy as we would draw. We wouldn't draw it quite like that today, but the elements are as we would include in a modern cross-section. Just local disturbances. So, even Geikie recognizes these are his quotes. Right, one of the most striking natural sections anywhere to see Northwest Highlands, oscillations of red sandstone, white quartz rock repeated again and again and again and again. Only local disturbances. I was like, really? So Murchison's quite happy to overlook this. By reading in that notebook I showed you a translation of, because you can't really read it, Geikie reflects the fact that he'd mentioned this to Murchison. Indeed, in his memoir, his autobiography, he also says this. And Murchison just, yeah, my boy, don't worry about that. It's fine. Just ease yourself, go and walk across to Otherpool and you'll see everything's all right. So he was basically calmed down by Murchison and airbrushed this story out of it. An interesting aside, Geikie didn't get back to the hotel in Kinlochewe until after midnight. And Murchison had tried to call out the locals to go looking for him, but they said, no, you're not doing that. It's the Sabbath. He shouldn't be out looking at the rocks. Right, so I think that raises an interesting problem again about how we do science, because the tendency is always to look for a type section like Nocken, and generally to try and keep it simple and not downplay complexity. Complexity is difficult to deal with, and we don't like talking about it. And the tendency is to say, if you want to understand the geology of this area, walk up that hill and you'll understand it all. And we still do that, and I think it's really dangerous, obviously. So let's keep going. So that becomes the type section. This is too complicated, so they ignore it, even though they published it, and the world ignores it. That stays in play. That map is published a little bit after Murchison's death, even though largely based on Murchison's work, and Geikie publishes it alongside a expansive recognition of Murchison's brilliance. Story moves on. We're going to move on and on now. So the story moves on. So Geikie becomes Director of Scotland, which is when the map was published. He then takes time out to become professor here, and then he becomes the Director General of the Geological Survey. And he, for reasons we'll see in a minute, goes back and starts a campaign to build on the ideas that were established back when Murchison was alive, that stratigraphic continuity. And he'll do it in 1883. He'll send his two most trusted mapping people, John Horne and Ben Peach, alongside a rather suspect-looking Lionel Hinksman. And they're going to go up and start mapping in Durness there. And in Geikie's own words in the annual report for 1883, the Geological Survey, he says that this will serve as a baseline from which all our sections across the Highlands will start. So basically he says, this is known ground. It is. It's about the only place any fossils have been found at that time. And so he's going to work out from there. Right. They don't get a clear run at it because Geikie also says, we're going to take you guys to the important sections where in previous years I've established what's going on. So he conditions the way they're going to view the ground like that. In his, you get that in the annual report. In his memoirs and his subsequent accounts, he says they were given a clean hand with no theory, just go and map what you see. That's rubbish. They were led to map what he wanted them to map in the first instance. Again, that's the sort of thing we do. If you start off a PhD student on some ground, you often say, come on, I'll show you what's going on. Now go and do your PhD. Not a good idea. If you want them to be an independent researcher, they should try and find that themselves. Right. So the question is, what about this? There are these strange crystalline rocks. They're not at Knocken, but they are, Nichols found them in various places at Kinlochewe. He also shows some other cross sections which are agreed in around Ullapool that there are these strange rocks on contact. What about that? Well, people start getting twitchy about this. This is ahead of 1883, and this is why, probably, that on his first, basically, Geikie's first task as Director General is to send his core troops to go and sort the problem out properly. That's under pressure, and the reason it's under pressure is people start asking this question, what about the Logan Rock? And this allows that access. Railways. Suddenly now, people can get up to the Northwest Highlands relatively, well, much easier, well, probably easier than they can today, actually, given the state of the railways. And so here's that map. Let's draw the railways on. Acnasheen Station, and Butler Bridge also provides access. Legg also provides relatively easy access into that ground. And those are the sites people can go to within, a short hop from those stations for the first time. Previously, you had to go all the way around the coast and then try and get inland and negotiate a time on a mule. So people could begin to ask the question, what is the Logan Rock? And they went to that outcrop in Kinlochewe. There it is. The term was coined, I've said it wasn't Nichols' term, it was coined by Heddle, who went into that ground. And interestingly, lots of people went there and made definitive statements about what is the Logan Rock. And they looked really closely at a hand specimen. And it's another great example of the proverb of the blind men and the elephant. Interestingly, that's Ben Peach's elephant from his notebook. And so you all know the story. If you grab a bit of an elephant and you're blind, you only see that. You say it's a snake, it's a tree trunk, it's a leaf, it's a rope. And so people were doing that. So let's look at it. What is the Logan Rock? This is a piece of it you can take with a photograph. It looks slightly igneous-y, might be sort of granitic-y. You can find, fairly coarse igneous textures in it. Look a bit further, though, and other people say, hang on a minute, it's got banding in it. Hang on a minute. Ooh, this looks a bit nicey. Oh, yeah. So these are all outcrops within 10 meters of each other. And the idea that a rock type can't be characterized by one hand specimen. Again, this is an important lesson for anybody, certainly for my students, when they go out and you say, give us a rock description of a unit, if you go into your mapping projects, and they'll do, and that'll be it, rather than look at the context of the variety of rocks that make that mappable unit. A lot of guys didn't do this. So we have a bunch of ideas, and an interesting quote from Will Huddleston that said, yeah, whenever you find this stuff, yeah, geological interpretations go a bit haywire. So Nicholl thought it was intruded up faults. Geikie recognized it was Nisos in places, but thought that somehow it had been metamorphosed in place. presumably by some sort of laser beam. And then you've got, Bonny goes and says that it's Hebridean and faulted in. So it's Hebridean being a synonym for Lewisian. And Heddle says, yes, it's metamorphic, it's Nisos, but no way is it Lewisian. Definitely not. What I find really amazing is, given the variety and how little rock people are seeing, is how definitive they are in print. And it's a really good example of sample bias, and it's a really good example of trying to generalize too soon for not making enough observations. So we don't understand what the diversity is before you generalize. Again, it's a common problem in science, certainly in our science. And the biggest problem is they're all talking about hand specimens out of context. Here's the context, here's the outcrop on the top. It's the thing we now call the Kinloch thrust. You can find all that diversity in that block and the next block up the stream that we've been looking at in the last set of slides. And it sits on a low angle contact that you can, if you get on the other side of the river, you can put your head underneath and sitting on carbonates. Clearly a low angle contact. I don't understand why, Nicola spent time in here. I mean, why people, okay, he didn't like the idea of steep faults, but why you would fake it? Anyway, so the point about this is that by bringing more geologists in, you increase the diversity of interpretation. And we're all prone to these sorts of shortcuts and human failings. But if you have more than one person or more than one group doing it, they get challenged and they don't sustain. And the key part of all of this, I think, is the importance of having and encouraging diverse interpretations, not by you, not by your group, but by competing groups, competing with a very small c. We should be striving to understand together. Let's move the story on and get the idea of the context. One of the first people to really think about context for these strange rocks was Charles Callaway. Again, he doesn't get enough credit. So he recognized the same sedimentary succession, either side of what we now know as Lewisian on here, recognized both above and below. He also recognized that those are the same gneisses. So that's I should say, that is a really terrible diagram because he doesn't show the same ornament for the gneisses. So you look at that straight away and you think they're different. They're not, they're the same. So let's add the color to make that point and point out his text, which is the first time in print you'll see the word thrust in a geological context as a verb. Most people say Geikie coined the term the following year, and he did as a noun, but that's the first time you'll see it, at least in my knowledge, in print, certainly for the Northwest Highlands. So he clearly says what's going on, that these are old basement rocks carried over the sedimentary on that structure, the structure we now know today as the Glencore thrust. He presents this in May 1883. Remember that year? That's the year that Geikie sends Peachhorn and Hinksman to Durness. They are there, more or less, as that happens. At that meeting that Callaway presents, Charles Lapworth presents his maps from Erebor. He publishes them the following year, so it's generally assumed that it happens later, but he's shown this to the public, his maps and sections, then at the GeoSoc in May 1883, showing gneisses sat on top of right way up sediments. Now the honourable thrust. That summer, he's visited by Teal and John Blake. Teal working for the survey, sort of part-time-ish at the time, and John Blake just recently Professor of Geology at Nottingham. Blake almost gets no coverage in the story. I think that's really unfortunate, because Blake then, on the basis of what that was seen, and they've seen at Arnable, goes walkabout across the Northwest Highlands and publishes in the following year at the GeoSoc, after Lapworth's paper, these cross sections, including that one there across Glencool, which not only shows what he calls moving gneiss, in other words, the thrust sheets, and a sliding fault, what we call the thrust, but also imbricates underneath. So he's getting the elements there in that paper. And it's really surprising. He's got some really weird ones as well. He's got other ones at Arnable, which is and various other relationships. And he's showing complexity, but sort of the structural elements that we can go to explain it. And he's gone and really, and he also makes some strange things, some philosophical things about the nature of scientific revolution and the advancing wave. The key point about this is he saw a lot, but the real clincher, the reason, what I mean by context is a map. Because you can do quite a lot of variety. If you just see it in a section or in 1D or 2D, you can make a number of interpretations. But something that works on a map that represents a 3D world, you're really limited on the types of geometry you can put in. That was realized by Lapworth. That's Lapworth's field map for part of the Arnabol area, and probably the greatest exponents of all of that at the time, Charles Clough, with his imbricates at Glencoe, somewhat later, well, not that much later, 2 years later, he makes that map for Glencoe. And that's the real key point. It's about making the map. Something, again, which is probably not recognized enough, that this is still important today. It's not just a catalogue of where the rocks are, it's making definitive statements about what the relationships are and exploring the consequences in 3D. That's the point of mapping, and it's totally important today. Right, so coming back to this, the whole point about the railways is it opened the opportunity for diverse interpretation. You've got Lapworth, you've got Blake, you've got Teal coming along on his holiday, you've got the survey working, you've got all the others working as well and coming in. So not only can they see and make their own contributions, they can actually challenge each other's interpretations. And that allows the process to happen. Diversity. It's not just about access, it's also about behavior. Murchison and Geikie were super rude about Nicol. They were questioning his ability as a scientist. They were saying that he couldn't prioritize what he was looking at. He was shouted down. They arranged, essentially, he was bullied out of his activities. After 1861, he never published again on the area. Even though he went back there, he felt he couldn't really engage in the debate because of the hostility these guys had rained against him. It's an adversarial silo. It continued until 1884, and Geikie realized actually Lapworth was right. But running up to that, the amount of, in 1883, the correspondence that Geikie, when he started hearing about those results, was really vitriolic against them, again, thought they were charlatans. And again, it's not right. Why was he doing that? What was strange? What was going on? And he wasn't the only one at that time. What was it about Victorian geology that made it so adversarial? I'm just going to dip back. We're almost there. But I'm going to dip back to his first published book, and you can begin to see why when he writes about this place, which you might recognize. Because he talks about its importance for the history of science. Now, we'll just bring out the key words. Out of conflicts, perhaps yet more tumultuous than those of ancient nature, there emerged at last the clear demonstrable truth. He sees that battles and aggressive antagonistic debate are fundamental to getting to that last word. I think that's completely the wrong way round. Because he was adversarial, it meant that he stayed in his silo and he wasn't challenged. And then he went basically, unless you have challenge, if you're not able to do it yourself, unless you have external challenge, it's hopeless. He wasn't alone. You should read what James Judd said about mapping and sky. That's what I spoke about last week. Right, so they weren't alone. There were exceptions at the time. Teal collaborated with Lapworth. Teal discovered shear zones before they were really famous in the 1960s. They collaborated on the textures of myelonites and so forth. So some people could break out of this antagonism. They didn't get much credit at the time. But this is what's going on. This is an example. The clique that Geikie was trying, essentially establishing in his early work, that was sort of keeping the survey view unchallengeable, is like what we have today, essentially through the social media campaign. They are talking shops where people are staying in their silo, not recognizing each other at all, being rude about each other, but not finding the common ground where the truth, if you want to use that word, may lie. Certainly the opportunities may lie. And the reason, again, this is important, we have this antagonism between these guys and these guys who are essentially bullied out of the way. But if you're not able to play the game, if your personality, you might be the best geologist in the world, have the greatest ideas and the best scientific method, but if you don't have if you're not resolute enough to stand that kind of, alpha behavior, you don't play the game. How many people do we not encourage into our science because of that type of stuff? You might think that's in the past. I don't think so. Not everywhere. I'm not saying everybody's like that at all, but I think that's what we miss. And it means that we risk going down rabbit holes and we don't really get a true feeling of uncertainty, that we are dealing with an uncertain subject. We don't get to run the experiments very often. We're trying to interpret stuff. Interpretation by its nature requires diversity, and we should really try and make sure we get it. So thank you very much.